For 80 years, the United States built and led the most successful security alliance in world history. And now the same country that created NATO may be the one that's going to unravel it. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Let's start with what happened today. The United States asked NATO partners for help keeping the Straits of Hormuz open. That request matters because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically significant waterways on Earth. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passageway. But many NATO countries showed little interest in joining the United States in a potential confrontation with Iran. And the reaction actually tells us something about the state of the alliance itself. To understand why, you have to understand what NATO was originally designed to do. After World War II, the United States faced a fundamental strategic question. Europe had just destroyed itself twice in 30 years. Germany had invaded its neighbor in both world wars. Rivalries among the major European powers had repeatedly plunged the continent into catastrophe. American leaders realized that simply punishing defeated countries, as had been attempted after World War I, would not produce anything approaching a lasting peace. Instead, they tried something radically different. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, pouring enormous resources into rebuilding the economies of Western Europe, enemy and friendly alike. That wasn't charity, it was strategy. The idea was that a stable and prosperous Europe would be less vulnerable to extremism, less prone to conflict, and ultimately beneficial to the United States itself. A rising tide lifts all boats. But economic reconstruction alone wasn't enough. The political and military structure of Europe also needed to change, and that's where NATO came in. Most people today think that NATO was created simply to counter the Soviet Union, but that's only part of the story. Yes, NATO did deter Soviet expansion, but especially in the beginning, it solved a deeper problem that had plagued Europe for centuries: the balance of power among the European states themselves. By integrating the United States and Western Europe into a single alliance, NATO effectively removed the possibility that countries like Germany, France, and Britain would begin competing militarily with each other once again. In effect, American leadership became the stabilizing force for much of the rest of the world. The United States provided the ultimate security guarantee, and in doing so, helped transform Western Europe from the most war-prone region in the world into one of the most stable. For 3/4 of a century, that system worked remarkably well. But that system depended on a particular way of thinking about international politics. The United States accepted that maintaining a stable international order sometimes meant carrying a disproportionate share of the burden, not because American leaders were naive, but because they understood that a peaceful and prosperous international system ultimately benefited the United States just as much as anyone else, if not more. American prosperity, American security, and the global order were all intertwined. Enter Donald Trump. Donald Trump approaches the world very differently. His worldview resembles what political theorists call classical realism. It's the worldview famously captured by the ancient historian Thucydides: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. In that framework, alliances are not long-term systems designed to stabilize the world. They are transactions, and they are transactional. Partners must pay their share. Relationships exist only so long as they provide immediate advantage. From that perspective, NATO doesn't look like a strategic system that has preserved global stability for decades. It looks like what Donald Trump would term a bad deal. And that philosophical divide is perhaps the most important factor in the global tensions arising today. When the United States asks allies to participate in military operations, NATO governments usually expect a process: consultation, joint planning, shared strategic objectives, ratification by the UN Security Council. That's how alliance warfare typically works. But when the military action appears sudden, unilateral, poorly coordinated, other countries become cautious, not because they oppose the United States, but because NATO was designed to prevent destabilizing wars, not automatically expand them. And that's why today's hesitation from NATO partners matters. The trust and the fundamental values that helped establish NATO are, in fact, eroding. And all this comes close on the heels of Donald Trump's insulting rhetoric about Greenland. Trump has repeatedly suggested that the United States should annex Greenland. Greenland, of course, is the territory of Denmark, and Denmark is one of our NATO allies. Now think about what that implies. NATO was built on the premise that member states do not threaten each other's territorial integrity. That is an assumption that's baked into the NATO Charter. The alliance assumes that disputes between members are resolved peacefully, while the alliance as a whole focuses on defending against external threats. If the United States ever attempted to take territory from another NATO member, the alliance would face an impossible contradiction. The entire structure of NATO assumes that its members are partners in maintaining stability, not rivals competing for territory. Even talking about such scenarios begins to erode the trust that the alliance depends on. And here's where the deeper irony and the fundamental ignorance of Donald Trump starts to come out. The international system created after World War II made the United States the most powerful country in the world. We didn't do it alone. American economic power, American security alliances, American leadership of global institutions, all of these things reinforced each other. If that system weakens, the consequences will not only affect small countries that depend on it, it will affect the United States itself. Because the stability that NATO helped create is one of the foundations of American prosperity and security. The upshot here is that Donald Trump's worldview is fundamentally incompatible with the values that underlie NATO and its mission. For 80 years, the United States has led a global system designed to prevent the kinds of catastrophic conflicts that defined the first half of the 20th century. NATO was one of the central pillars of that system. But alliances don't survive on military power alone. They survive on shared values, shared assumptions, and trust. And the real question facing NATO today is not about defense spending or naval patrols. The real question is much simpler. Does the United States still believe in the system that it created? Because if it doesn't, the alliance that stabilized the world for 3/4 of a century may not survive the century that follows. And we will all be worse for it.